everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey. I've got with me today the wonderful Jessica Rabbit Guillermo Lomas. Hi, Jessica. How you doing?
Hi. I am here as the replacement of your esteemed man with a name much longer than mine. I thought I'd just come and pretend to be Jason, Neil Patrick Harris, Johnston, Yellen, Squared, and his other names. Dramgolf.
Do you cringe when I say Jessica? Like, does that, like, do you prefer I mean, obviously you prefer Jess, but when I say Jessica, do you like,
It is kind of jarring. I sort of forget that that's my name because the only person who calls me that is my mum.
Oh, right. So you're in trouble.
It's like a full Sunday check, you know, like if you hear it, then I'm like, I'm either at some sort of official appointment where I have to use my real name or, it's my mum. My mum getting me in trouble.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, last week we put a question out to our listeners because every other week we do sort of a news episode, and we'll do a Single Cast Nation news episode, and then 2 weeks later we'll do like sort of a news industry episode, and this week is our news industry episode. We put a poll out to our listeners with a number of options. One of the options was the topic of today's discussion, which is this rule that was recently enforced where European producers of rye whiskey are no longer allowed to produce. Well, they can produce a rye whiskey. They simply can't call it rye whiskey. Mm-hmm. And Jess, you had said, hold on a second. I know someone who's an expert about this, and she's actually written an article about this. Jess, do you want to do the introductions here?
Okay. Well, I was first of all hoping that you would start us off with a much more dramatic, heightened, clickbaity. Canadians say Europeans aren't allowed to make rye whiskey anymore. So I'm a bit disappointed you didn't fall down that trap I was mentally creating for you. But you did. You put it out. And I had, first of all, I had seen this issue come up as a friend of mine shared it. And I thought it was, it was released on April the 1st. I thought, oh, that's a hilarious April Fool's joke. And then realized that it's not. And I feel like they probably could have timed the announcement for that for maybe the day before. But anyway, so I saw a number of places across my social medias telling me about it. But the thing that caught my eye the quickest when I realized that it wasn't a joke was that there were several people sharing a bunch of articles, and one of which was our guest of today. And I'd like to introduce Heather Storgaard. And she has written an article that's appeared on Whisky Advocate, but maybe we should stop yammering and let Heather introduce herself. Hi, Heather. Thanks for coming on the podcast at very short notice.
Hi, Jess. I admit when I saw your name written as Jessica, I was like, oh yeah, Jess's name is Jessica. So it's very much a Sunday name for you.
I like that you only question Jessica and not the two middle bits, which are, I realise, hideous inside jokes if they've never come across your screen either. So I'll tell you the story for the other two names next time I get to see you in person. But this is
over a dram of rye whiskey, perhaps.
Yes, illegal and now illegal rye whiskey. This I have to tell you because Jason, our other usual co-host, I am replacing. Replacing in air quotes, don't worry, Jason. We try to keep this our news podcasty bits a tight 35, which is a running joke from our inability to make it a 30-minute podcast. So I'll get into all the funny names another day, but I think we should deal with the matter in hand here, which is I've got its full official title written down here, and then I'm gonna hand it over to you for a bit. Treaty E104976, which in classic all things European regulations has a really short, handy title, which is Agreement between Canada and the European Community on Trade in Wine and Spirit Drinks. And talking of jarring things, 2003. I think spirit drinks is one of the most jarring ways to describe this category. But yeah, Heather, you reliably informed me that it wasn't a joke and that you had in fact been discussing it for a while. Why did this come to your attention?
well, originally, before I was sucked into the world of whiskey, I studied law. So legal things, I guess, piqued my interest in general. And I saw some articles written in Danish about 3 or 4 weeks ago that brought this topic up. And I questioned my entire ability to speak that language as I read the articles and thought, what on earth is going on here? I can speak Danish, by the way. So I was correct in my understanding, and kind of started discussing this with people. I was at a conference in Kentucky where I was telling people, have you heard about this? And nobody had. And then suddenly, on April Fool's Day, it exploded. And a lot of the European rye producers had done a coordinated campaign to kind of make the point that this is even more crazy than anything people could come up with for April Fools.
Yeah.
Of course, that slightly backfires when people think it is an April Fool's, which is slightly what happened, at least for you, Jess. So I started talking to distillery owners and had a wild day of pitching stories on the topic because I just felt like I had to try and tell this story. I speak Danish, I speak German, I know about how important rye is in those regions. Then I have a legal background and I write about whiskey. So I thought I need to cover this.
Yeah, I definitely also thought of you quickly because of our shared Nordic connections, and anybody who knows anything about anything kind of Scandi Nordic, and I guess that does creep into more mainland Europe, knows what kind of fundamental part of life rye as a grain is in these places. And so obviously that's a really important part of the story with a lot of these producers. Josh and Jason have interviewed the guys from Stauning. Literally 2 weekends ago, I was staying at Kyrö Distillery in Finland, enjoying their beautiful rye whiskey. So it's a really important part of when they start to explain the brands. And I think because when you try and add a bit of local context to a whiskey, if you are a region where rye is a very prevalent grain, then it would make much more sense that you would be using rye as a heavy input, or in the case of some of them, 100% rye for the liquid. So it kind of baffled me when I also started looking at this agreement that it actually even would exist in the first place, and that it had quietly been bubbling away in the background, because I also took out my legal hat and had a little dive through the regulations. And actually in the article, it states that it was supposed to be a transition period of 2 years from the date of enactment, so 2003 for this agreement. So this should have been a non-issue or an issue, but something as of 2005, not 2025. So
I think because there were so few distilleries in Europe at that time, it kind of wasn't thought about very much. And, all trade agreements are a negotiation between two parties, in this case, Canada and the EU. And if you do read the trade agreement, you'll see that the EU gets a lot of protection for its drink products, wines and spirits. I mean, if you think of all the different kinds of wine in France and Spain and Italy, before you even start on spirits, the EU got all of these protected in Canada, because previously you could be a Canadian winemaker and you could say you were producing champagne until this agreement came into force. So at the time, perhaps back in 2003, they'll been negotiating, prior to that as well, rye whiskey, which wasn't being made in Europe very much. There was one producer in Austria that's known of, but it was not a big thing. That will have been quite an easy thing back then to just say yes to. Yeah. And then as these whiskey distilleries launch, particularly in the Nordics, no one's really looking, because, rye is so integral to, from my perspective, to Danish culture. I know Finland is also absolutely, rye is at the heart of their food culture. Their national food is rye bread that was voted for by the people. They will have just gone with what was natural to them. They know rye. Okay, off we go. Let's make a whiskey from it that's somehow local. So I think we've kind of got this, just massive problem that's almost seems to have come from nowhere, but has this background.
So I've got two questions for you here. If in 2003 this agreement was put into place at a time when European whiskey producers or spirits producers didn't even produce a rye whiskey, you know, I wonder why that was even put into place, because it seems as if that wasn't a lever to pull, right? There really isn't any transactional weight there. That's question number one. Question number two, why all of a sudden now are people taking notice of it, you know, some 22 years later?
Yeah. So question number one, I think if we look at the history of Canadian whiskey, which obviously also has a long background, a long heritage, and it's really linked with rye. So for them, you know, this was an insurance that their products were going to be protected, just like the EU was getting protection in Canada. And then it also would ensure that nobody was profiting off some form of association with Canadian whiskey. Obviously, that's not really worked, because we now have award-winning rye whiskey made in Europe. Stouning have just won recent awards for single cask, single rye. And so question number two is the central and the most challenging one of this whole saga, really, because no one is exactly sure, or nobody I've spoken to is exactly sure. So there's been some questions to the EU from various kind of food authorities in member states, such as Finland and Germany, where they're questioning, you know, how is this deal actually enacted into force? One of the questions submitted by the German authorities was about whether the spelling of whiskey matters, because in Germany you've got the absolutely brilliant Stork Club Rye Whiskey Distillery, and they spell whiskey with an E, as you would in Ireland or the USA. The agreement, however, is with Canada, so whiskey is spelt without an E in the agreement. So the Germans have gone to the EU and said, you know, how are we looking at this? Is whiskey and whiskey synonymous or not? Okay. And the EU have said, yeah, in this case, they are so close that it's synonymous. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing here. I don't have that document open in front of me. But
EU decisions are famously just as concise and quickly written as that. Like, yeah, seems the same. Carry on, lads. We're going to count it as all one. Of 50,000 page document as a return.
It would be lovely. Yeah, it would be lovely if they were as concise as I just made it, wouldn't it? Yeah. But essentially that's what's been said. So there has been this dialogue between EU member states and the EU on this matter. But we don't know if that's what's triggered it. The other thing that could have triggered it is that Canada is currently looking at potentially changing their spirits regulations and definitions. Has someone working on that looked into treaties and realised what's going on? I don't know. It could even just be that, you know, there's been more publicity around European rye. It's been a topic. For example, I know it was in the schedule at Bar Convent Berlin last year. So maybe just somebody has seen it and gone, wait a minute. But it's quite hard to know, and I would love to know.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because we're talking about it and it's now in the news, but I haven't seen any threats of enforcement or any producers being taken really to task over their use of the language. So I wonder if it's just that people are kind of being a bit more philosophical. And I think your theory that maybe it's somebody doing research into the treaties is probably more likely than somebody has tipped off one of the producers that you need to be changing all of your labels because they're not going to be compliant. Because I think Stouning have come out and said this situation is really ridiculous, because I know they're trying to really focus on the US market. So and we have talked previously on the podcast about the vernacular of words and the arrangement of words, especially for approval with the TTB. Stouning have said that for their products going into the EU, they have been told into the US, they have been told specifically they have to label it as rye whiskey. But if we are following this treaty for Europe, Stauning are not allowed to call themselves rye whiskey. They have to call it something like whiskey made of rye and barley, which is the same product, but this is just words for arrangement on a label for to be compliant with both sets of people enforcing either side, which is kind of crazy, I think. Joshua's pulling a face as if he's thinking really hard with his TTB hat on.
So as far as their labeling goes, they can't call it rye whiskey for sale within the EU.
Correct.
But they also can't call it rye whiskey for export into the US?
No, they have to call it.
They have to,
but is the EU blocking
Nope.
that label? Okay.
The EU saying that's US's problem.
Export.
If the TTB are okay with you, those words, then that's a US-based problem. We're not interested. Now, what would be interesting
but it's
would be...
obviously a...
And I was going to say it would be interesting how the Canadians would expect that to be interpreted for their label, because potentially we could end up in a situation where a European rye going to Canada has to have one set of naming, but a rye coming from the US into Canada, which may be technically less rye because you only have to be 51% rye in the US, whereas Kura, for example, is 100% malted rye. So a less rye product going into Canada can be called rye whiskey, but 100% rye coming out of Europe going into Canada can't.
I don't know how much you guys know about Canadian whiskey definitions, because this is where this whole thing gets even more crazy.
Up this box.
Yeah. So in Canada, there are three terms for whiskey that include it's Canadian whiskey, rye whiskey, and Canadian rye. So those three have the same definition. They're interchangeable. So what you can have in Canada is a whiskey with no rye, but if we all agree that it tastes maybe like the flavor profile is a bit rye-like, you can slap a label on it that says rye whiskey. So we now have a situation in Europe, for example, where we have our lovely, say, Canadian rye. It's got no rye in it. We have Stauning's rye or Kuro's rye. That can't be called rye whiskey. Now, of course, this is something that the EU has originally agreed to, but from a consumer perspective, from a trust perspective, this is, quite frankly, ridiculous. You're writing the name of a grain on something that doesn't contain that grain,
right? And
you're avoiding the name of the grain on something that potentially does contain it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think it's absolutely bonkers, and I think it's a testament to funny bits of legislation that stick around and they're largely ignored until somebody says, "Wait a minute, there's a rule here," and I think it's mad. I really hope that the sound that is being made from the European producers is a kind of call to arms and some sort of like gathering of people to start petitioning. I think it's a joint committee that it mentions in the trade agreement itself to push for it. I think from my reading of it, there is potentially there's a kind of almost get out clause that you could approach this joint committee to ask for the name to be changing, because it talks about misleading consumers. And the example you just gave there, Heather, is perfect. It's entirely misleading to have a Canadian rye that contains no rye. Meanwhile, the people who make actual rye are not allowed to call it rye whiskey.
Yeah. And I think the majority of people in Canada would agree that this is clearly problematic. Whatever they do with their own legislation, I doubt that Canadians are in love with the fact that you can call something rye whiskey when it's got no rye in it. It's just not very logical. So you have a problem sort of domestically within the Canadian whiskey industry as well there. But yeah, hopefully this committee I don't know who the committee's made up of, but whoever comes on this committee can figure out some kind of change or compromise that really works for everyone, because, we're also in Europe at the moment dealing with tariff threats to the US. We've talked about Stauning exporting to the US. How's that going to continue? There's a lot of questions in the whiskey world right now. And it feels like this is a bit of a battle that almost shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, I was, thinking about Stauning specifically, who, with a number of their bottlings, they screen print on their bottlings, right? They don't necessarily have a labeling system. So if they're screen printing rye whiskey on their labels, now they have to, their product is potentially locked up, right, to sell domestically. They have to cover up the word rye on their bottlings. So that presents a money issue. Then there's a tariff issue exporting to the U.S. By the way, apologies. So this could be incredibly damaging. So to that point, with the committee that European rye producers have to appeal to, what's the time frame look like with these appeals? Can changes be made? Is there a process involved? How long does that process take? What does that look like?
Yeah, so within the agreement, it says that the committee should meet within 90 days of being called upon. So hopefully it's, as bureaucracy goes, a relatively quick turnaround. But the financial impact of this, the time impact for these distilleries who, as I've said, are already going through a hard time, is really threatening to what is ultimately still quite young businesses. There's only been, as we've said, this treaty from 2003 wasn't even thinking about rye whiskey in Europe. And we now have beautiful, amazing rye whiskey producers in the north of Europe who are winning global awards with their rye. So it's a little bit easy to forget the context sometimes, that these are younger producers still who are really just trying to find a way to make the most of their local grains, of their, some of them their farming expertise in their local communities, and make a product that that people can enjoy and that will bring people to their home regions in tourism. And that's really what's under threat right now, which is... For me, I kind of get a bit emotional about it. I've spoken to a lot of the distillery owners, and I mean, this is it's totally threatening their livelihoods right now in a time that's not easy for anyone in the spirits business. So
I think it's also, when you think about when I first heard about the treaty, when it was no longer a joke in my head, and I realized that actually we're not necessarily talking about these European producers wanting to trade into Canada. It's a blanket ban on a German rye producer who maybe has absolutely no intentions of ever selling his product outside of Germany because, small scale, they just don't have the ability to scale up their production. This product is not technically, it's a domestic product, but because of a rule made 20-something years ago with a nation that they're not exporting the product to, they can't call it rye whiskey. And I think the very long-reaching effect of that is bizarre, to say the least, I think.
It is. Another kind of quirk of this treaty is that it only protects rye whiskey in the English language. So you could go ahead and call your German rye whiskey Roggen whiskey, so translating rye to the German. But Germany is a much more multicultural, multilingual country than it was in 2003. So you have a lot of people who would more easily be able to access what that whiskey is if it's in English. And that's another issue that they potentially weren't thinking about, 20 plus years ago. That's
especially crazy when you consider how multilingual and how multicultural Europe is across the board, and how I found in a lot of stuff that I've looked at with European regulations, there's always a consideration to language. So again, seems kind of weird that hasn't been considered here, but potentially, I guess, in the short term for some of our producers, that could give them a tiny leg up in how to go about renaming their products. I know that Kira have joked about calling it like Finnish whiskey in Finnish, or like changing the way they call it whiskey born in a sauna, which is of course their origin story is that it was all of them in a sauna together. You know, but that's not helpful if you're trying to attract people who don't, you know, they're not knowledgeable about maybe what the grains are called in a different language, or they understand inside jokes. If you want to introduce somebody completely new to your brand, to have to be like doing a lot of backtracking and legwork around the issue is not particularly helpful to making people buy your product.
It's a transparency issue. This whole thing becomes a transparency issue. I mean, also the example of Finland, it's a minority language, but you have a 2-language situation in Finland with both Finnish and Swedish. So even if you're keeping your whiskey domestically in these EU countries, putting it in one language doesn't necessarily work, right? Stauning, for example, they're not far, well, they're in the south of Jutland. There's a German minority in the south of Jutland. Yes, they probably speak Danish, but you're already hitting the fact that Europe is a multicultural place, and English is used as a lingua franca that is so brilliant for export as well. Everyone can, or maybe not absolutely everyone, but the majority of people at a whiskey fair in Amsterdam will be communicating in English with one another, because that's globalization today. So it's a problem with language for sure.
Yeah, given that the word here, rye, is the targeted word, my guess is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, my guess is that when this committee meets, that this should pass without issue, right? That it should be difficult to say no. We're going to continue to protect Canada here because you know, this stipulation that we put forth in 2003 is correct. You know, to protect rye in this case would be like protecting grapes in France. Meanwhile, wine is made worldwide, or protecting barley for Scotland. Meanwhile, single malt is being made globally. I can understand protecting bourbon in the U.S. or protecting champagne in France or Armagnac in France, but protecting rye as a cereal or malted barley as a cereal just doesn't, you know, make sense.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. And you also have producers hitting this issue where, for example, they have to include on their labeling what's in the whiskey, what grain, and at the same time they can't say it's a rye whiskey. So you kind of got these problems in particular because of rye. One quirk of the treaty, though, is also that the EU has had corn protected. Corn, Korn, is a German spirit, a German and Austrian, sorry. That's the German word for grain. But we're not hitting as many problems with that because it's not in English, and German is not a global language in the same way that English is. But you do, with modern eyes, look at this treaty and go, why did, you know, how has this all been accepted? Of course it was accepted. So now, there is the question of what will this committee say? And of course, the Canadians are well within their rights to be arguing for the sake of their whiskey industry. I hope that the EU values the whiskey industry that has grown in the last 2 decades in its member states, because there isn't as much heritage related to whiskey in the EU. So it's more easily... It's not as intertwined with culture as in Canada. I mean, I was in Toronto back in November and went to the distillery district, and you know, whiskey is a part of Canadian culture and heritage, particularly rye is a part of that. But there is also the fact that this is a grain, and we have a problem with transparency. We have a problem also with competition here. If places like Stauning, Kiro, that are award-winning rye producers, can't be labeling and marketing their whiskey, you know, from their perspective, that's a big competition problem.
I wonder as well if it's for some of the other producers, if maybe it's like a mixed. So it's clearly a massive problem for Kura because their whole shtick, or that's underselling them, but their whole product base is 100% malted rye, whereas Stauning and a distillery whose name I can never pronounce, and you can definitely correct me on this, who I think are two, who I share an importer with in Brunius, are a fantastic rye producing, but they also, like Stauning, have mixed mash bills, so they grow their own spelt and oat. So they could kind of shift towards, I guess, maybe marketing a multi-grain approach and because their grains are all their own from their farm. They have another kind of angle that they can sort of shift to in the short term. I really hope, that the European Commission, when they review these committees, appreciate that the innovation has been shown by these producers, and they deserve being protected just as much as champagne producers who have been around for slightly longer. Have it
just a bit longer.
This argument about being able to protect a place but not material is really strange to me, because we have lots of European marks of PDO, which is protected denomination original, I think, and PGI, which is to do with geographic locations. It seems weird that this rye has become a sort of slipped through the gap to get away with the whole article, the whole agreement. When I looked at it is clearly much more focused about protecting wine, and like you said at the top, this like regions that are very famous of their wine, especially in France. And then rye just seems to be like flung in. And I wonder if that was part of the negotiation. They're like, well, there's a much bigger heritage and tradition towards rye in Canada. Maybe it was seen as a kind of, you've had a bit on wine, we want our say on spirits, and rye is the...
Absolutely. I mean, everything like this is a negotiation, right? And at the time, there wasn't much rye whiskey production in Europe. So this is, everything's a give and a take. And maybe this was, I don't know, I wasn't there, but maybe this was an easy kind of, oh yeah, they can have that. We're not taking up that space. However, if we look at rye as a word, if we look beyond whiskey, there is this massive link to Northern European cultures and Northeastern European cultures. I have a friend, Laura Valley, who is an Estonian rye researcher. She's just finished her PhD looking at rye, and she's now writing a book about it.
Joshua, we've met her.
I spoke to her.
Sorry.
Have you met her?
We've met her, Joshua, when we went to the bread labs.
Yeah, you probably did.
All right.
We definitely did, because she introduced herself as doing her thesis on rye, and Chris and I instantly were trying to guess where we thought she was going to say she was from, and we had guessed finished, and she said Estonian. Yep. So there you go, very small rye world.
Tiny world.
Yeah, I mean, she's writing a book, which is very exciting.
She's got a book deal kind of off the back of that PhD research, which is incredible. And I was trying to get her to talk to her about rye and kind of an anthropological perspective last week. And she was at a rye event in Berlin. So, yes, the rye world is very, very much more rich than you might ever think. But, I did speak to her in the end, and she said that 80% of the world's rye is grown in the north and northeast of Europe. So like the Baltics, Russia, the Nordic countries. So if we're looking at rye as a word, if we're looking a bit beyond whiskey, then, these European regions have an incredible heritage present, and hopefully future of rye being an integral part of culture, which makes this whole thing even harder, doesn't it? Because from the local perspective, you start to feel like, you're very, grains that you've grown up with that are part of your food culture, you're being told you can't use them in a new way that is whiskey. So
I'm confident that if we had a similar rule about whiskey or Scotch whiskey no longer being allowed to call Scotch whiskey, I think there would be quite the outcry. So I think it's entirely justified for Northern Europe to be more than slightly annoyed, but to discover this treaty is possibly going to be enforced. It's difficult. I did have one little thought when I was looking at this, and I don't know if you'd also considered it, Heather. There is a possible ramification because there are a couple of producers here in Scotland and in England. There are people like Fielden who are producing rye whiskies. In Scotland, we already have a funny non-naming of rye whiskey anyway. I know the guys at Inchdarney call themselves, they have a different phrasing for it because technically otherwise it would have to be a British spirit drink. Do you think it would also be really important in the impact maybe the SWA could do with joining up with these producers within Europe and the joint committee? Because I think there's a possible impact here too.
I think it's bigger than, I think we scratched the surface. As we discussed already, we don't even quite have clarity on why this has come up 22 years later. We just can theorize on that. I think the other one to look at is Ireland. Powers make 100% Irish rye. Obviously, Ireland has a stronger kind of whiskey lobby than most EU countries. We have the SWA in Scotland. There is the sense that we're looking at it right now, and it mostly seems to be Germany and the Nordics who are talking about it. But the conversation needs to be bigger, and these players need to get involved as well. It's obviously kind of with Brexit, it's even messier in a UK context because 2003, this covered us. Now we're not a part of the EU. So when this committee meets, it's going to be EU and Canada officials. Where do we stand? Where do our rye producers in England and Scotland? I don't know of any in Wales. Forgive me if there is a Welsh rye producer somewhere. But how are our British rye whiskey producers going to kind of get their voice is a really big question. Yeah.
Well, there you go. Heather, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Is there any question that we haven't asked that we should have asked, that we should have addressed?
I don't think I think we've got through a lot of questions. I think for me, it's just really important to remember that these are really, passionate distillery owners who are being affected. And it's bottles, it's labels. But I've been to a lot of these distilleries. There are two, for example, that you mentioned before. It's on a family farm. It's been in the family since the 1770s, I think. And this is threatening, their livelihoods. So, there really does need to be some movement, some resolution, just some clarity on what is going on. And we need to remember the people in this.
That is a perfect place to end on. Thank you again, Heather. For our listeners, thank you again for voting on this topic for us to discuss. For anyone listening, if you didn't know about these polls that we put up, if you're a Single Cask Nation member, you'll find these polls in our private Facebook group. If you are a Single Cask Nation member and you're not in our Facebook group, you can find the link in your emails. We also have these polls in our One Nation Under Whiskey group as well, also on Facebook. If you want to email us, you can email us at info@singlecasknation.com. Jessica Rabbit Guillermo Lomas, thank you as always.
You're welcome.
And Heather, thank you. It was nice sipping on a little Stauning as we had this conversation. And until next time, cheers.